They say there are hollers in the Appalachian highlands where the trees whisper names you should never repeat after dark. Places so quiet the only sound is the wind combing through pines, until, suddenly, it isn't quiet at all. Old-timers will tell you those woods have always been hungry. They'll lean close, lower their voice, and mention 3 names almost swallowed by time: Hester, Nessa, and Rue. Triplet sisters born in the final years of the 19th century. Girls who, according to mountain lore, grew up strange and hard in a world already built on hardship until their story became too vile, too unsettling, for polite history to keep. You won't find them in school textbooks. You won't see their birth listed in the courthouse ledgers that survived floods and fire. But go deep enough into family papers and forgotten county records, and you'll catch glimpses. An 1898 baptism entry with 3 infant girls listed only by first name. A census sheet smudged at the edges that shows a coal miner's shack holding 9 souls. Then silence. The rest of what we know lives in the thin space between record and rumor, the place where history runs out and mountain storytelling takes over. The tale usually begins on a winter night colder than most. A blizzard shut the logging roads and turned the valley into an island. Inside a drafty cabin, 3 newborns wailed while their mother bled and their father panicked. Some say the birth killed her. Others insist she lived but never spoke again. What matters is that the triplets were raised without warmth. Their father, a man described in later whispers as mean when sober and meaner when drunk, scraped a living hauling timber and sometimes vanished for weeks. Neighbors saw the girls running wild, thin as rails, eyes watchful beyond their years. This was the Appalachia of the early 1900s. Coal seams opening, timber barrens stripping hillsides bare, poverty everywhere. Families survived on whatever the mountains offered. A few hogs, a garden, hunting, barter. Education was a luxury. Churches tried to knit moral order from isolation, but brutality had a way of leaking through the cracks. Children grew up tough or didn't grow up at all. Hester, the eldest by minutes, was said to have a stare that made grown men shift. Nessa followed, quieter but clever, the one who learned to listen when adults thought she couldn't. Rue, the smallest, smiled easily, but was the first to bite if pushed. Together they were a unit, rarely apart, communicating in glances. Other children feared them without knowing why. Adults muttered about something off, but offered no help. Hard lives breed harder judgments. Local legend paints their adolescence as a slow schooling in cruelty. Not the theatrical evil of fairy tales, but the grinding meanness of neglect. They were beaten when food was short, mocked when they showed intelligence, ignored when they cried. Somewhere in those years, the sisters turned inward. They learned that the outside world would not save them. Survival meant watching, planning, striking back when necessary. Old neighbors remembered small signs: a bully's sudden bloody nose, a dog freed from its chain, a man's porch mysteriously collapsing after he'd threatened their father. Nothing to prove guilt, everything to hint at calculated payback. By 17, the girls had no friends left of their own age. Men in town eyed them with a mix of desire and fear. Preachers spoke of wickedness. Some families crossed the road rather than meet their gaze. Still, no one intervened. In isolated mountain life, people minded their own business, especially when the business looked like trouble. The story fractures here because what happened next was never written cleanly down. Some say an outsider, a traveling salesman or a small-time preacher, wronged them in a way no one would name aloud. Others say their father, long violent, crossed a final line. Still others whisper about a feud with a wealthier family that owned the timber rights and crushed anyone who defied them. What's consistent is this: something broke that winter. The triplets, already feared, became something more, dangerous in a way that unsettled the entire valley. Folklore remembers a single night when light flickered against the mountains where no light should have been. A structure, some call it the girls' own cabin, others a rival's storehouse, went up in a sudden blaze. Screams were heard, or maybe that's invention. What's documented is that by morning, several people were dead and the triplets were gone. Gone as if the mountains swallowed them. Authorities stumbled. The county sheriff, one man with a horse and a deputy, arrived too late. Snow had erased tracks. Neighbors gave conflicting stories. Some swore they'd seen the sisters heading north. Others claimed a wagon carried them west. One woman insisted she saw them at dawn, standing at a ridgeline, hair loose in the wind, watching smoke rise. None of this reached the newspapers in any lasting way. The incident was buried under euphemisms. Domestic tragedy, accidental fire, disappearance of 3 young women. In an era with no appetite for scandal among the poor, erasure was easy. But erasure doesn't stop storytelling. In the hollers, parents warned children about the triplets. Do not cross cruel girls, they'd say. Do not assume the quiet ones are harmless. Ballads cropped up, rough, haunting verses about 3 sisters who'd been wronged and answered wrong with worse. Miners sang of them on night shifts. Women whispered their names when talking about self-defense in a world that gave them none. To this day, hikers in remote stretches of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky swap versions of the tale. Some call them witches, others vigilantes. Some say they found refuge among traveling showfolk, others that they fled north and lived quiet lives under new names. A few insist their descendants still walk those mountains, eyes just as sharp, memories just as long. What's striking is how completely the official record rejected them. County archives list a major fire, but no culprits. Death certificates for several adults stopped abruptly that winter. No burial details. Church minutes mention a terrible event, but not who caused it. It is as if the world decided 3 poor, angry girls were better forgotten. A choice that tells its own story about power and gender in that time and place. For a modern listener, the opening of this saga feels like stepping into a lost America. Remote, harsh, morally ambiguous. A place where law came late and survival often meant silence. Into that void stepped 3 sisters, forged by neglect and rumor until, one night, they crossed a line no one dared to record. This is the story mountain people still call the Triplets of Hollow S Ridge, though their real hollow had other names. Hester, Nessa, Rue. 17 years old, bound by blood and hardship. Too dangerous for the history books, but too unforgettable for memory to lose. What follows is what we can gather. Scraps of evidence, the echo of ballads, and the lingering chill of a story too dark for polite retelling, yet too alive to die. To understand the triplets, you have to understand the mountains that made them. The southern Appalachians at the turn of the 20th century were not the romantic postcard country later sold to tourists. They were rugged, poor, and often lawless. Families like the one Hester, Nessa, and Rue were born into lived in shacks clinging to steep hillsides, roofs patched with tin, gardens scratched from thin soil. Men cut timber or scratched coal. Women kept house and raised children in endless labor, and everyone relied on barter more than cash. The region had seen wave after wave of extraction. First came timber companies that clear-cut the hills, leaving scarred slopes prone to slides. Then coal outfits arrived, building company stores and running scrip economies that kept miners trapped in debt. With few schools and little medical care, children learned survival early. Death in childbirth, work accidents, and disease were part of the rhythm. Violence, too, was accepted in grim silence. A feud might flare for years without outside law ever intervening. The triplets' father, Rue Cade, was one of many men who drifted between timber and mine work. Records show his name on a payroll ledger in 1903, then again in 1905, each time docked for drinking on the job. Local memory paints him as mean, quick to fists when drunk. Their mother, Rue Cade, appears in a single midwife S book as having birthed 3 live girl babes, one February night, but she fades from written records soon after. Some say she died of fever, others that she lived but became withdrawn, never recovering from the brutal winter that took 2 of her other children. Hester, Nessa, and Rue grew up with almost no schooling. A traveling teacher stayed 1 season but quit after constant sickness and threats from angry fathers who disliked girls being filled with fancy notions. The sisters learned reading only in fragments from a Bible their mother had owned. They spent long days hauling water, tending pigs, and helping older siblings cut firewood. Hunger was constant. So was the sound of men's boots when payday came and tempers flared. Religion threaded through the hills, but it was a hard, fear-soaked faith. Preachers warned of sin and hellfire, sometimes naming neighbors from the pulpit. Revivals could be ecstatic, but they also preached submission. Wives to husbands, children to fathers, the poor to their lot. For 3 neglected girls, church offered no refuge. One neighbor remembered seeing them arrive at a brush arbor meeting barefoot, hair uncombed, and leave before the sermon's end when a deacon barked at them to sit still or go home. Their isolation fed a deep bond. Witnesses, few though they are, speak of the triplets moving as one. Hester spoke most. Nessa listened, eyes always scanning. Rue smiled a sly, knowing smile that adults found unsettling. They developed their own half-language of whispers and signs, so close they could hold a silent conversation across a room. This bond was their armor in a childhood where trust was dangerous. Poverty shaped more than hunger. It meant vulnerability to exploitation. Company men expected favors from desperate families. Drifters and peddlers knew backwoods girls had no protection. There are vague accounts, half remembered by grandchildren, of the Cade sisters being cornered or harassed. One tale tells of a hired man who went missing after bothering them. Nothing was proven, but gossip about his sudden disappearance stuck to the girls like smoke. As they reached adolescence, each sister's personality sharpened. Hester, dark-haired and lean, developed a fierce, almost prophetic air. She spoke in short, certain sentences that made people pause. Nessa became skilled at bargaining. She could coax extra cloth or food when others failed. Rue, the youngest, played the fool to mask a quick temper. They were, in mountain terms, hard young women, self-possessed in a culture that punished female independence. By 17, the triplets were effectively on their own. Rue Cade wandered farther, sometimes gone months. No mother, no adult ally, and a town that feared rather than helped. They supported themselves through odd jobs, berry picking, washing, occasionally guiding loggers through the hollers for pay. It was survival work that kept them fed, but also exposed them to danger. This period bred both their reputation and their resentment. Stories tell of the girls confronting a man who tried to cheat them, refusing to bow their heads. One merchant claimed they looked through you like they knew every sin you ever hid. Another story, likely embroidered with time, says they ran off a gang of drunks by pelting them with rocks and curses so fierce the men fled in shame. Whether true or not, such tales made them both feared and fascinating. The wider context mattered too. The progressive era was dawning elsewhere in America. Cities talked of reform, women's suffrage, child labor laws. None of that reached these mountains. Here, law was a sheriff's whim, and girls like the Cades had no standing. If abused, they were expected to endure. If cheated, to accept it. If harmed, to stay silent. But the sisters were watching. They had seen what silence bought their mother. They had seen neighbors crushed by debt and humiliation. Somewhere in these years, the idea must have formed. If the world would not protect them, they would not bow to it. Not rebellion with banners and speeches, but a quieter, more intimate rejection of victimhood. Mountain folklore often blurs fact and myth. It folds personal vendettas into ghost stories, survival into legend. The Cade's backstory slid easily into this tradition. Hardship and neglect produced not passive victims, but sharp-edged survivors. Their intelligence was misread as witchcraft, their self-possession as evil. Fear grew around them, not because they cast spells, but because they refused to be small. This fear is the prelude to what happened next, the event that turned 3 neglected girls into a caution whispered for a century. By the winter of 1916, the Cades were 17 and nearly alone. Neighbors described their cabin as dark at night, no light but the hearth. The father was absent. Rumors swirled of trouble with a wealthy timber boss who demanded labor and respect the girls would not give. A traveling preacher had been seen visiting, then leaving in anger. The triplets were said to have been cheated in wages. One neighbor, Ace's diary, a rare surviving personal record, mentions strange goings-on with them, Cade girls, folk best stay clear. Then came the night the story truly begins. The night of smoke, shouting, and a building consumed while snow fell silent. Official accounts would later reduce it to an unfortunate blaze. But those who lived nearby knew it was more than an accident. They had seen the sisters harden under years of neglect. They had seen injustice ignored. And after that night, they would never see the girls again. What remains from this backstory is not detailed confession, but a pattern. 3 young women forged by deprivation, taught by a brutal world that safety was an illusion. They learned to read danger and repay it in kind. Whether what followed was revenge, desperation, or a fight for survival, it did not arise in a vacuum. It was the end of a childhood no one saved. No one in the valley could point to the exact moment fear of the Cade girls turned into dread, but most agree it began the winter after they turned 17. Before then, they were strange, proud, and hard, but still tolerated as part of the local patchwork of misfits. After that winter, people crossed the road rather than meet them, and neighbors locked doors earlier. The first spark came with work. Timber bosses had pushed deeper into the hollers, hiring anyone who could swing an axe or guide mule teams along dangerous ridges. It was brutal, poorly paid labor, but for isolated families it meant cash when gardens failed. Hester and Nessa sometimes took day jobs guiding haulers. Rue cooked for crews when camps passed near. One November, a boss from out of state, a man named Crowder, remembered as loud and arrogant, refused to pay them for a week's work. Accounts differ on the quarrel's details. Some say he mocked them in front of other men. Others that he threatened to teach them manners. What's consistent is that the sisters did not bow. Hester, according to one witness, stood silent until he finished, then said something so cold it sent a shiver through the camp. 2 nights later, Crowder's supply shed burned down. No one was hurt, but his food stores and tools were ruined. The sheriff called it a lantern accident. Crowder packed up and left before spring. In mountain memory, this was the first sign the triplets would not suffer humiliation quietly. People began to watch them differently. Other incidents followed. A man who cornered Rue on a footpath turned up days later with a broken arm, swearing he had slipped on ice. Another time, a storekeeper who tried to short them on flour woke to find his wagon axle sawn through. Nothing fatal, nothing that drew lawmen far, but enough to weave a reputation. The Cade girls did not forgive wrongs. They were clever, patient, and unafraid to strike back when safe. Local gossip grew, embroidered with each telling. Some called them witches, saying they could curse a man's luck. Others insisted they had allies among traveling folk or union men. Mothers told sons not to trifle with them. Fathers muttered that them girls bring ruin. Still, because no one died and no proof stuck, fear remained private. Publicly, the sisters were left alone, which may have been exactly what they wanted. Then came a summer of deepening poverty. Coal prices dropped. Timber camps laid off men. Hunger sharpened tempers. The Cade girls, already marginalized, became scapegoats. When a sickness killed livestock, some blamed them. When a young boy went missing for 2 days before wandering home unharmed, delirious from fever, neighbors whispered that witches had lured him. In isolated places, superstition and resentment confuse into something dangerous. That autumn, a traveling preacher named Isaiah Pike arrived. He set up camp meetings in hollows, drawing crowds with fiery sermons about sin and women's obedience. He railed against wild girls and witchcraft, by name though without pointing fingers. Folks recall the triplets attending once, standing at the back. Some say Hester laughed quietly during his call for repentance. Others insist Nessa asked a question that stumped him. What is certain is that after their appearance, Pike thundered even louder about Jezebels and devils in skirts. He claimed God would smite wicked women. Fear and fascination swirled. One night his tent collapsed in a storm, crushing supplies and ruining his revival. The next morning, the Cade sisters were seen walking away along the ridge road, calm and dry, while others bailed water. No one could prove sabotage, but suspicion landed squarely on them. Pike left soon after, vowing the valley would regret ignoring his warnings. People who once pitied the sisters now crossed themselves when they passed. By early winter, the girls were nearly myth. Children dared each other to run to their cabin and knock, but few tried. Adults who needed guides paid in advance and kept their distance. Their isolation deepened, but so did their legend. And in legends, details darken with each retelling. Somewhere in these months, a final grievance flared, one big enough to trigger the night the official record smothered under euphemism. A timber boss named Martin Hale, wealthier than most, known for cheating workers, extended his reach into their hollow. He demanded rights of way across small homesteads, paying little or nothing. Stories say he tried to force the sisters off their bit of land or claim what little their father had left. Another version says one of Hale's men cornered Rue violently, and when the sisters protested, Hale laughed and threatened worse. There's no ledger or court case to confirm it, but nearly every oral account names Hale as the man who pushed too far. Soon after, a series of events unsettled the valley. Hale's men complained of traps on logging paths, of tools gone missing, of mules spooked by unseen figures. One wagon was found overturned, its load scattered and the harness cut. Hale sent word he would have the girls arrested if they interfered again. The sheriff, weary and underpaid, ignored it. He had no proof and no appetite for conflict. Then, one bitter night in late January, smoke rose from Hale-less outpost, a supply barn and bunkhouse where a handful of his men slept. The fire consumed the structure before help arrived. 2 workers died. Hale's property was destroyed. Again, the official verdict was accident, blamed on a stove. But Mountain Talk said otherwise. "Them Cade girls warned him," one old man later told his grandson. "He thought poor girls couldn't fight back." After that blaze, the sisters were seen less. Some say they came to town once more for supplies, silent and unsmiling, then vanished. Others swear they moved deeper into the hills, living wild. Hale offered a reward for their capture, but got no takers. People feared his wrath, but feared the girls' revenge more. This was the turning point, from petty retaliations to something fatal. It changed their legend forever. Fear hardened into taboo. Families who had traded gossip now spoke cautiously, as if invoking the triplets might invite bad luck. Children were told, "Don't talk about Hester, Nessa, and Rue." Officially, nothing tied them to the blaze. The sheriff's notes, one brittle page, mention lack of evidence, possible vagrants. Hale rebuilt, but moved his base closer to town. A year later, with his profits down, he left the valley. The sisters' cabin was found empty, door swinging, ashes in the hearth. No bodies, no trace. Yet in song and whisper they grew larger than life. Ballads described 3 wild women who punished cruelty when no one else would. Preachers turned them into warnings about female rebellion. Folklore painted them as wolves in girls' skins, moving unseen through snow. And behind each story was a kernel of truth. 3 daughters of neglect who refused to stay helpless and, when pushed too far, answered in ways polite society could not bear to record. For modern researchers, this phase, their first open acts of resistance, explains why later tragedy was buried. Mountain justice was messy, and male violence was often tolerated, but 3 young women striking back broke a deeper taboo. It threatened the social order more than any drunken brawl. What we know ends here with smoke and silence. After Hale's outpost burned, the trail goes cold. Rumor claims bounty hunters searched but never returned. Others say sympathetic kin ferried the sisters out under cover of night. Perhaps they vanished into new identities in mining towns farther west. Perhaps the mountains took them. What matters is what remained. A story powerful enough to live without paperwork, told in kitchens and campfires long after officialdom chose amnesia. It is here that the legend of the Appalachian triplets stops being a string of petty retaliations and becomes something darker. An unrecorded feud turned deadly, three sisters stepping outside every boundary their world tried to draw around them. No one agrees on the exact night the triplets disappeared, only that the valley remembers it as a hinge when ordinary fear turned into legend. Some say it was the first new moon of February 1917, when the mountains were black and sound carried for miles. Others insist it was later, closer to spring thaw, when rivers ran high with melted snow. Whatever the date, the air was brittle cold, and something in the hollow felt wrong long before smoke was seen. The winter had been harsh even by mountain standards. Food was scarce, work scarcer. Hale, the timber boss whose shed and outpost had already burned, returned after a few weeks in town with a crew of armed men. He had sworn to root out whoever had cost him wages and lives. Most folks stayed quiet, knowing better than to be caught between a vengeful boss and three girls who already had a reputation for retaliation. Hale's men patrolled ridge paths, questioned neighbors, and left warnings nailed to fence posts. The Cade sisters, according to rumor, were sighted once or twice, moving light and fast across backcountry trails, never stopping long enough to be cornered. In late winter, the balance tipped. Hale set up camp near the sisters' hollow. He brought extra hands and a preacher willing to condemn female sin from a makeshift pulpit. Their presence was meant to intimidate. People whispered that he threatened eviction for anyone who helped the triplets. Some feared he would simply take their cabin and claim the land. That week, strange things began happening again. Supplies vanished from Hale's wagons. Axes were found dulled or missing. Mules bolted in the night. One of his hired guards woke to find his boots gone, cut clean from beside his bedroll. These were pranks if you wanted to call them that, but every man on that crew felt the hair rise on his neck. Hester, Nessa, and Rue were unseen yet present, a ghostly counterweight to Hale's swagger. Then came the night of reckoning. It began with silence, an unnatural hush that old woodsmen still recall when telling the story. Dogs stopped barking. Even the usual wind that funneled through the holler went still. People lying awake in cabins felt the quiet like pressure in their ears. Somewhere in Hale's camp, a light flared. Lantern, torch, no one knows. And shouts followed. Some say a scuffle broke out among his men. Others insist they saw figures moving between trees, swift and sure-footed. One terrified boy claimed to have seen three shapes at the tree line, braids whipping in the cold, before his father pulled him away and barred the door. What is documented is fire. Sudden, massive, devouring Hale's encampment faster than anyone expected. Tents and timber stores ignited. Wagons overturned in the scramble. Horses screamed and broke free. Men shouted orders that no one followed. Those who ran for the creek found bridges sabotaged or paths blocked by fallen logs. Whether these obstacles were chance or planned is impossible to prove, but survivors swore the chaos felt orchestrated. By dawn, the camp was ash. Hale himself survived but was badly burned and half mad with rage and humiliation. A few of his men were not so lucky. Their names appeared briefly in the town paper before being forgotten. The Cade sisters were nowhere to be found. Their cabin, when approached days later, stood abandoned, hearth-cold, few possessions left behind. Neighbors said it looked as though someone had left in a hurry, but knew where they were going. The sheriff arrived 2 days after the blaze. His report, one brittle sheet of handwriting, survives. Accidental fire. Possible vagrants. No bodies of missing girls. He blamed tipped lanterns, dry kindling, the usual winter hazards. No arrests were made. Hale demanded action, but offered no proof. Without witnesses willing to speak and with his own reputation stained by failure, he returned to town, defeated. Yet in the valley, the official version fooled no one. Everyone understood that the sisters had been pushed too far. They also understood that saying so aloud was dangerous. Hale still had allies, and the sheriff would not risk his position. So the truth stayed underground, carried by song and whispered warning. 3 girls wronged beyond endurance, 3 girls who fought back when no one else would. From this night forward, the legend shifted from rumor to myth. People stopped treating the sisters as mere troublemakers and began speaking of them with a kind of awed caution. Mothers told daughters never to let cruelty harden them like it did Hester, Nessa, and Rue. Men warned sons to respect those they thought powerless. Ballads turned darker, describing three figures walking into the forest's mouth while flames lit the sky behind them. Some songs claimed they lived on as spirits guarding abused women. Others swore they became wolves roaming ridgelines under new moons. Hale's defeat also marked a turning point for the community. Timber bosses learned not to push so hard on the poorest families, at least for a while. Fear of unseen retaliation kept some abuses in check. It wasn't justice, but it was a pause in unchecked exploitation, and locals credited the Cade sisters even if only in private. For historians, this moment is where the paper trail ends and folklore takes full control. There's no census entry after 1917 listing Hester, Nessa, or Rue. No marriage or death certificates. No later sightings that can be confirmed. The only hard data is that Hale's camp burned and he left the region soon after. Everything else lives in oral tradition, fragments of testimony from grandchildren, half-remembered verses sung at dusk, warnings passed through families that, the Cade blood runs hot, don't wrong it. What's striking is how quickly officialdom erased the girls. Newspapers of the time focused on Hale's losses, calling the fire a tragedy for business. They framed the sisters, if mentioned, as runaways or suspected thieves, not as people reacting to systemic abuse. Court archives contain nothing but that single sheriff's note. It was easier to pretend the girls never existed than to admit three poor teenage women could outsmart men with power and weapons. Yet erasure couldn't fully hold. The mountains have long memories. In kitchens and on porches, people told the story quietly, each generation shaping it anew. Some softened it to warn daughters against anger. Others sharpened it to encourage resistance. Even today, a few Appalachian storytellers keep the names alive, often changing details but preserving the heart. Neglect can forge a will fierce enough to upend the order of things. Looking back, it is hard not to see this night as a collision between two forces. The raw power of an exploitative system and the private fury of those it crushed. The Cade sisters had no vote, no legal standing, no protection. What they had was intelligence, unity, and nothing left to lose. When Hale pressed, they pressed back, and the valley learned that fear is not the sole property of the powerful. Whether you see them as villains or vigilantes depends on how you judge desperation. What is certain is that their act, whatever the precise details, cracked the story their world told about powerless girls. And that crack, though quickly papered over by officials, remained in song and memory. By the time dawn broke over the ashes of Hale's camp, the Appalachian triplets had crossed fully into myth. The last anyone claims to have seen them, they were walking the ridgeline, silhouettes against a blood-orange sky. Some say they vanished into coal country, others that the forest swallowed them whole. History chose silence. Folklore chose to remember. Morning after the blaze, the hollow smelled of wet ash and iron. Smoke drifted low and stubborn between trees. People emerged cautiously, as if the night's violence might still be waiting. Hale's camp was a blackened ruin. Wagons warped, iron tools twisted, tents reduced to cinder. Survivors, few and shaken, sat silent. Hale himself paced like a wounded bear, his hands bandaged, eyes wild. The triplets were nowhere. The sheriff arrived well after dawn, leading a single deputy. He found no bodies belonging to the sisters, no clear trail of escape. Snow and mud had swallowed footprints. The official investigation lasted less than a day. His report, a single page later misfiled in county records, called the event an accident. It cited lantern mishandling and volatile winter stores. No witnesses were quoted. No questions were asked of neighbors who might have seen figures in the woods. For a region accustomed to neglect, the brevity was unsurprising. Hale raged publicly, demanding arrests, offering rewards for the girls alive or dead. But his power was fragile now. He had lost men, supplies, and face. Workers deserted him. Investors pulled out. Timber rights shifted to a rival company. Within months, he packed what wealth he had left and moved east, never to return. His departure, while not celebrated openly, brought a hush of relief to those who had suffered under his exploitation. For the wider valley, the aftermath was complicated. On one hand, fear of retribution from unseen hands made some lives marginally safer. Timber bosses tempered their cruelty for a time, unsure if other wild girls might be watching. On the other, patrols tightened. Strangers were questioned harshly. Women traveling alone were stopped and searched under the pretext of public safety. The Cade sisters' defiance triggered both caution and backlash. Among local families, the event quickly became a moral parable. Some elders told it as a warning. See what anger will bring, exile or death. Others framed it as necessary justice in a world with none. Around fires and quilting frames, women whispered that the triplets proved survival could include resistance. Men warned sons not to mistake poverty for weakness. Children absorbed a lesson beyond any schoolhouse. Law might side with power, but the powerless could still shape fate in dangerous ways. Songs multiplied. Ballads about Hester, Nessa, and Rue traveled beyond the hollow with miners and loggers. Lyrics changed, but themes stayed. Three sisters wronged, standing together and disappearing into freedom or death rather than submit. Some songs softened the violence, turning the fire into symbolic cleansing. Others described ghostly figures guiding lost travelers. In a culture where music carried history, these verses became the triplets' record when courts would not. Yet the legend spread also twisted it. By the 1920s and 30s, traveling preachers used the sisters as cautionary villains. Women who forsake obedience bring ruin. Children were scared with threats that the Cade ghosts would snatch the disobedient. In this retelling, the sisters' humanity, poverty, neglect, survival, vanished, leaving only sin and punishment. Each generation reshaped the story to fit its fears or hopes. For historians, the decades after are a blank wall. Census rolls never list the sisters again. Marriage records, obituaries, prison ledgers, nothing. They may have died in the woods that night, overcome by the very fire they unleashed. They may have fled under new names, merging into coal towns where no one asked questions. Oral accounts occasionally claim distant relatives heard from Aunt Hester out west or Nessa in Tennessee, but none are verifiable. What endured was impact. The hollow changed after the fire. Women were treated with more wary respect. Men thought twice before preying on isolated girls. Exploitation didn't end. Poverty rarely lets go. But raw impunity cracked. Some locals quietly called it the Cade effect, the understanding that cruelty could boomerang. Outside the mountains, the event barely registered. Newspapers buried it under small headlines. Business journals discussed timber losses but omitted the sisters. Urban readers never knew 3 teenage girls had shaken a boss and lived, at least long enough to disappear. Their erasure was deliberate and convenient. The poor have no lobby, and female rage fit no narrative polite society wanted. Yet erasure isn't total when people keep telling a story. Families handed down warnings and pride in equal measure. Ballads endured. Folklorists in the mid-century recorded fragments, puzzled by their power. Scholars today find in the legend a rare thread of female defiance in a landscape often written as purely male. For survivors of similar exploitation, the story still resonates. It doesn't romanticize suffering, it shows the cost. The triplets lost home, name, maybe life. But they refused quiet submission. That refusal, however messy, however tragic, became a secret inheritance for those told to endure and stay small. Time has a way of sanding down the sharpest edges of a story, but some names resist. In the southern Appalachians, where memory often travels by song and whispered tale, the Cade triplets refuse to disappear. They survive not because of court records or newspaper ink, those vanished long ago, but because people kept telling and retelling, adjusting details but guarding the heart of the legend. Today, if you drive those ridgelines, you'll pass rusted mine shafts, abandoned timber railways, and hollows where whole communities once lived. Ask the oldest residents, and some will still murmur the sisters' names. They speak quietly, not sure whether the girls were heroines or omens, but certain they mattered. That alone is remarkable. Poor, teenage women from an erased corner of America held onto a place in cultural memory without help from any official historian. Their story endures because it cuts across so many silences. It shows what poverty, neglect, and gendered violence can do when left unchecked. It shows how people with no legal standing, no vote, no property, no allies, sometimes act in ways the dominant culture cannot admit. And it shows how quickly those acts are buried when they threaten an established order. For women of the region, especially those who grew up isolated, the legend carried mixed power. Some mothers used it as a warning. Anger destroys, so hold it in. Others offered it quietly as strength. You are not helpless, even when the world tells you so. Neither version was perfect, but both kept alive the idea that the triplets existed. Real girls who refused silent suffering. The legend also complicates how outsiders romanticize Appalachia. Too often, the mountains are painted as quaint or backward, a place of passive hardship. But the Cade tale reminds us the region has always been alive with complex responses to injustice. Sometimes survival, sometimes small rebellion, sometimes open confrontation. The sisters fit no easy stereotype. They were neither saints nor caricatures. They were poor young women making desperate choices inside a violent system. For scholars and folklorists, their story illustrates how unofficial history works. When records erase, communities improvise. Ballads, gossip, and cautionary tales become archives. We may never know the exact sequence of events. What sparked the final conflict, how the blaze began, where the sisters went. But the persistence of their memory tells us the emotional truth mattered more than dates or affidavits. People needed a story where the powerless could push back, however imperfectly. Modern Appalachia still grapples with many of the forces that shaped the Cades: extractive industries, poverty, gendered vulnerability, distrust of outside law. Remembering the sisters isn't about glorifying harm, it's about facing what drives people to desperate ends when every safe path is blocked. It is about refusing to let the forgotten remain invisible simply because their lives made the comfortable uneasy. There is also something universal in the triplets' arc. Their world offered no protection, no schooling, no safe authority, no justice when men exploited them. Their options narrowed until action and disappearance were all that remained. Across history, similar patterns repeat wherever marginalized people are cornered. The Cades become stand-ins for countless lives lost to neglect and silence. Some storytellers today reclaim them as figures of feminist resistance, though cautiously. They are not neat icons. Their path costs lives, perhaps their own. But they embody a refusal to be erased. In a culture that told poor mountain girls to keep quiet or perish, they did neither. That alone challenges the idea that history's victims are always passive. It's telling how quickly those in power scrubbed the record. Hale, embarrassed and ruined, moved on. Officials shrugged and filed one-page reports. Newspapers turned tragedy into business loss. By forgetting the triplets, they preserved the story they preferred. That order holds, that girls without backing can't shake powerful men. The oral record, stubborn and unruly, told otherwise. Listening now, a century later, you can hear both warnings and hope in the tale. It warns what happens when abuse goes unanswered, how desperation breeds danger. And it holds hope in the sense that even the smallest, most neglected lives can alter the narrative imposed on them. Memory, not law, saved the Cades from total erasure. Drive the back roads near where their hollow likely lay and you'll find no marker, no signpost. The forest has reclaimed most traces, yet many locals claim the place feels heavy. Some hikers say dogs balk and refuse to go further. Whether superstition or subtle inheritance, the air itself seems to remember. That's the power of story. It haunts ground long after wood and stone are gone. If you followed this tale from the first cold night of their birth, through hunger and hardening, petty revenge and open defiance, you can feel the weight of all that silence pressing in. These were not monsters, though some called them that. They were not saints, though some wanted them as symbols. They were three human beings raised in neglect, taught by pain, and driven to a breaking point the world refused to acknowledge. And in refusing erasure, they forced a crack in the wall that tried to contain them. History will probably never fill that crack with neat answers. We will not get their own words or know where they went. But we can hold space for what their lives mean. That injustice breeds stories it cannot control. That forgotten girls sometimes write endings too dark for polite pages. And that memory, stubborn whispered sung, can outlast official silence. As long as people in these hills keep whispering Hester, Nessa, and Rue, they are not fully lost. Their tale is part caution, part quiet empowerment, and wholly human. It belongs where it has always lived, in kitchens, on porches, in songs carried across valleys by those who know what it is to endure. And perhaps that is enough. The world tried to write them out. The mountains refused. Long after the last company rail rusted and the last boss left, the legend still walks the ridges. 3 shadows against an indifferent sky, reminding anyone who listens that silence has its limits.